So his full name is Ahmad bin Ali bin Abdul Qadir Al-Maqrizi. Who was he? Was the most important medieval historian of Egypt. But more so, he has also become a figure in the modern period that encapsulates the true Egyptian who loves his country and protests against the rulers that have ruined it.
Nasser Rabbat is the Aga Khan Professor of Islamic Architecture at MIT. Nasser describes himself as an architect and historian, and an opinionated citizen of the world, much like the subject of his latest book, Al-Maqrizi. Give us some background on the Mamluk period.
The Mamluks were basically the most well-trained fighters of their period. So they defeated the crusade multiple times, and they were the ones that stopped the unstoppable flow of the Mongols. They became the dynasty that all the Muslims are looking up to because they stopped two threats that were basically going to engulf the Islamic world.
Let's talk about Maqrizi and the Fatimids. His work is cited heavily in books about Fatimid history.
His book on the Fatimid, which has an extremely unusual title, is our main source on the Fatimid. Here is a guy who comes in and calls them Al-A'imma Al-Fatimiyin Al-Khulafa. So he's accepting in the title that they are imams, but then he also calls them Al-Khulafa. So he accepts that they are the caliphs. And the first part of the title is Itti'az Al-Hunafa. Hunafa is the plural of Hanif, which is the term in the Quran for people who believe in the one God, which means that Maqrizi is saying this is a book not just for Muslims, but also for Christians and Jews. They are all Hunafa.
Tell us how Maqrizi's work has lived on.
His theory of ruination, and that makes him and Ibn Khaldun very important to the Ottoman intellectuals from the 18th century on, who are realizing that they are losing the civilizational battle with the West, and they're looking for reasons. And this is a huge debate which we still live in today, which is basically, does the Islamic world have its own self-generated means of rejuvenation and recapturing?
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is about Al-Maqrizi, Egypt's most famous historian. Nasser, you spent years researching Maqrizi, writing papers about him, using his work in your teaching. Who is he and why is he such an important figure?
So his full name is Ahmad bin Ali bin Abdul Qadir Al-Maqrizi. Who was he? Was the most important medieval historian of Egypt. But more so, he has also become a figure in the modern period that encapsulates in his work, in his persona, in his life, in his opinions, sort of like the true Egyptian who loves his country and protests against the rulers of the country that have ruined it. That's what made him very important in the present days, because he's a model for the true Egyptian.
He was one of the top historians of the medieval period.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that at the time in which he was flourishing as a historian, so he was born around 1364, we're not 100% sure, and he died in 1442. So he lived a very long life for a medieval person. And the period around 1400 is the richest period in history production in pre-modern Islamic history. Nowhere else in the Islamic world, probably also anywhere else actually in the Western world, were there as many historians working in the same city at the same time on the same material. So it was an extremely crowded field, and still he managed to garner that reputation as the top historian of Egypt.
I think we need to talk about why there were so many historians in Egypt at this time.
Yeah. So we don't have a firm answer for that. But during the lifetime of Maqrizi, there are about 250 historians working in the capital on basically reporting on the ongoing events during their lifetimes. Most of them wrote chronicles of the time. In the case of Maqrizi, he does urban history, and this is really something that is very rare. There are very few people who write urban history, what we call khitat, and he understands urban history as something where you could actually bring in an opinion about why things are happening the way they are happening, whereas the others are just reporting names of streets and buildings and so on without any commentary. But why are there all these historians? It's probably because of the preponderance of patronage for ulama. Now, the class of the Mamluks, as part of actually showing off, every grandee of the Mamluks is supporting few of the ulama. The second thing is Egypt, after the first century of the Mamluks, when Egypt was actually giving all signs that it's going to expand and recreate an international Islamic empire, is now reverting back on itself. So we have all these commentators on actual events. And the third possible reason is because of the patronage of the Mamluks and the establishment of all these madrasas and khankas and institutions of learning in Cairo, you are now producing a lot of learned people, way more than you need. So some of them are actually turning to history as one way of showing their scholarship.
What was his character?
Well, I mean, we have to start from the get-go. His grandfather originated in the city of Baalbek in Lebanon. His father lived and worked in Damascus, and then he came to Cairo. Remember, all three cities were part of the Mamluk Empire. So he came to Cairo, the capital of the empire, seeking work in the administration. And in the meantime, he met a prominent personality who was a Hanafi judge of the army, and he married his daughter. That's Maqrizi's mother. So this guy, who is from somewhat of an unknown background, is marrying up into a family that is already well established in the administration. He has 3 kids with her, and then he dies, and Maqrizi actually grows up without a father. His mother is remarried to someone else whom he hated to the point that he does not write down his name. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, who took him under his wing and is his first educator, this judge of the army, whose house was actually a salon for all intellectuals to come in, and Maqrizi was taking part in that from the very tender age of like 5 or 6. So he was destined to become a scholar from the get-go. And then the grandfather dies, and Maqrizi now is on his own, and he's actually using all the connections of his father and grandfather to find himself a position in the administration. He's extremely pious. He does not like what he sees in terms of the corruption of the ruling class, even though he depends on patrons from the ruling class to get his positions. And at some point, he actually is introduced to the Sultan, Sultan Barquq. So he meets Sultan Barquq around 1390 something, 95, 96, and he becomes one of his boon companions. So he goes up to the citadel and sits around with other people, with the Sultan, and entertain the Sultan with stories and with parables and so on. Then he gets his break and he becomes the muhtasib, which is usually translated as the market controller, but it's actually much more than that. It's the person that makes sure that the city is functioning well according to the law. And he goes around the markets all the time, checking on everything, on prices, on produce, on behavior, on code of building, and who is sort of like encroaching on the streets or something like that. And around 1412, his current patron is executed by the Sultan, and that breaks his heart. So he decides to pull out of public life, retires to his family's home, his grandfather's home, and spent the next 30 years writing.
How did you discover Maqrizi?
So I came to MIT from UCLA in 1984. My project was to study passive solar energy in historical houses. And I had started looking at the houses in my native city of Damascus, but I have never been to Cairo. So I got a travel grant from MIT to go to Cairo and measure temperature and relative humidity in the courtyard houses that remained there. And of course, once you start researching them, you realize that Maqrizi is one of the sources. I fell in love with Cairo. I came back, went to my advisor, Oleg Grabar, and said, I have no idea what my dissertation is going to be, but it's going to be on Cairo. Now, what I fell in love with was the Mamluk architecture. So I gave up on the Ottoman houses that I was working on and started delving into the Mamluk history.
You said you fell in love with Mamluk architecture in Cairo. Describe it to us. What was it that you fell in love with?
Multiple things. It's highly, highly tectonic. It's an architecture in which form and structure and construction are integral. And decoration is not just something that is slapped on the surface, but it's part of the carving of the building itself. You can see it in the dome that is standing there behind you. It is probably one of the most sophisticated stone architecture. It is simple. They use a very limited number of variations or of elements, but they compose them and recompose them all the time in relationship to the street, because Cairo is a very crowded city. And the Mamluks are always fighting for more land, more real estate that they could build on. And they want, of course, their building to be seen. So there is always this attempt at squeezing as much spectacular elements, sort of like the wow effect, in a street that is narrow, that is winding, that doesn't afford space for someone to stand and look at it. But the most important thing about it is that it's really an elegant architecture. Proportionality is very important in the execution of Mamluk architecture. And when you stand in front of a Mamluk building, you see how the elements are balanced spatially, volumetrically, and visually. So I think actually Mamluk architecture is probably the most elegant Islamic architecture.
The Mamluk Sultanate reigned from 1250 to 1517, emerging from the weakening of the Ayyubids in Egypt and Syria. Within a short period of time, the Mamluks created the greatest Islamic empire of the later Middle Ages, which included control of the holy cities Mecca and Medina. The Mamluk capital, Cairo, became the economic, cultural, and artistic center of the Arab Islamic world. Mamluk means slaves. Ayyubid sultans depended on slave soldiers, who eventually overthrew them and established their own rule. After being taught Arabic, the fundamentals of Islam, and the art of warfare, slaves were freed and given responsibilities in the Mamluk hierarchy.
So can you set the scene for us of medieval Egypt? Give us some background on the Mamluk period.
The Mamluk period is one of the most peculiar and unusual historical period or state formation. Here is a bunch of people who are imported as slaves to be trained to become bodyguards of the princes. At a certain point, they rise to power, kill the son of their master, at the same time as defeating the French in northern Egypt and defeating the Sixth Crusade under King Louis IX, and they become the rulers of Egypt. But it's very unusual because now you have slaves who are ruling the country. We have another example, which is India, and it happened around the same time that a bunch of Mamluks or of owned ones took over. But the ones in India did not develop the same system that the Egyptian Mamluks developed, which basically depended on constant flow of Mamluks being imported from the Caucasus and from Central Asia to be brought to Egypt, trained for 12 years in military arts and in equestrian arts, and in reading and writing and in learning the Quran. They are converted to Islam, of course, and then they are manumitted or freed when they reach the age of about 18 and immediately conscripted in the army. And there they rise in the ranks to become emirs. And then the top are those who are actually fighting to become sultans. There is a certain meritocracy in that, but it's a bloody meritocracy, because in order to actually garner the position, you have to eliminate your opponents. That is the system. And the system is very much dependent on this constant flow of Mamluks who are trained and indoctrinated in a culture to become part of the society of Egypt. But they were very haughty, and they maintained that separation from the population. They spoke Kipchak Turkic. They did not speak Arabic. They actually intermarried only. At least in the first 100 years, they never married any Egyptian woman. The Mamluks were basically the most well-trained fighters of their period. So they defeated the crusade multiple times, and ultimately they kicked the crusaders out of the East. And they were the ones that stopped until that point, the unstoppable flow of the Mongols. The Mongols were building this huge empire, and they were defeated by the Mamluks in 1260 in Palestine in a battle that is called Ain Jalut. And that is the beginning of the glory of the Mamluks. They became the dynasty that all the Muslims are looking up to as the saviors of the Muslims, because they stopped two threats that were basically going to engulf the Islamic world. And as a matter of fact, if the Mongols were not defeated, Islam wouldn't have existed today. They probably would have eliminated it.
And so what period are we catching the Mamluks at right now?
The Mamluk dynasty lasted for 260 years, from 1250 to 1517. The Ottomans finished them off in between 1516 and 1517. 1517, they entered Cairo, and the Sultan Selim the Grim, the Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim, hanged the last Mamluk Sultan, whose name was Tumanbay, on Bab Zuela, on the gate of Zuela in Cairo. And that was the end of the empire. But during those long 260 years, the Mamluks managed to turn Cairo into probably the most well-endowed city in the world. And I would say until now, despite being a very rundown city, Cairo is still the jewel of Islamic architecture because of the Mamluks. They built in Cairo upward of 1,000, actually 900 and something monuments over the period of 260 years.
Now, Maqrizi catches the tail end of this boom.
Middle, yes.
The kind of end, getting towards the end of the glory days.
Mm-hmm.
He's born at the end of the 14th century. And this is when the system is starting to break at the seams. And so Maqrizi is looking at it and saying, where are the glory days? Mm-hmm. What is he kind of thinking and feeling?
So he analyzes the economic policy, analyzes the financial situation. He analyzes the government structure. He is very critical of the corruption and bribery and so on. He's very critical of the neglect of the agriculture and so on. But what he is the most critical of is how the state is deviating from Islamic rules, and therefore it's faltering. So he is very critical of the un-Islamic aspect of the Mamluk rule, and there are many. And that is the motor behind his criticism. He's out there in order to tell us that the country is falling apart, and he analyzes how that is. His whole book of the Khitat is organized around the theme of kharab, ruination, and he basically even is using some sort of a metaphysical approach to the notion of kharab, and also a mythical or mystical approach to the notion of kharab by looking at cycles of prosperity and ruination. In that, he is very much influenced by his master Ibn Khaldun, that had a cyclical notion of history. So Ibn Khaldun speaks about it in the abstract. Maqrizi comes and says, look, this is the history of Egypt. It's actually prosperity and ruination. And we are now at the most ruinous moment, and it is because of the corruption of the Mamluks. And this is where his critical voice becomes really very loud.
What were some of the main causes for ruination? What were the Mamluks doing?
The most important thing, according to Maqrizi, is their corruption, is the fact that they started selling positions, exchanging positions, and of course neglecting the maintenance of the sources of their wealth, which somehow ruined the economy. So the Mamluks had turned all of Egypt and most of Syria into iqta, which means land allotments. And what they did is that they divided all the money generating land into allotment to themselves. And they basically sucked these resources dry and did not maintain the dikes and the canals and so on. So the agriculture was falling apart. The security was falling apart because of Bedouins and others that would attack the agricultural land. And in order to recover what they are losing, they started taxing the population heavier and heavier. That ruined now the trade and ruined the economy of the city and the crafts and so on. And at the same time, they looked around and they said, where can we get more resources? The sultans now nationalized or monopolized the international trade. And that was one of the most important sources of income, mostly the trade in spices that was filtered from India, coming to Yemen, coming up to Egypt, and from there going to Europe through Venetians and Aragonese and few other Italian city-states traders. Once the Mamluks started taxing the spices heavier and heavier, the Europeans started looking for other sources of getting to the spices. And I would actually claim that the discovery of America is a direct result of the higher taxes that the Mamluks have put on the spices. And if you read the letter that Christopher Columbus sent to the two Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabel, in Granada. He met them in Granada 20 days after the fall of Granada to the Christians. And what he was saying is, I am going to find you a way where we can go around the globe in order to avoid these heathen Muslims who are taxing us so heavily. So I would say that actually there is this hidden episode of the role of the Mamluks in somehow encouraging, invigorating a search for another route to India.
While I was reading the book, three things really stood out for me. The first is that you called Maqrizi a rebel. Why is he a rebel?
He's actually a cowardly rebel. He himself is not going to take part in any rebellion. He didn't have the courage to actually partake in actual action against the Mamluks. But when he writes about these rebellions, and there are few of them that happened during his lifetime, he's full of praise and full of admiration for the rebels. Other historians, and remember there are about 250 historians working in Cairo at the same time, and so there are 6 or 7 of them that report on this one rebellion that is very important in 1387, and Maqrizi is the only one that not only is a friend of the leader of the rebellion, but he's actually a supporter of him once he is released from prison and he's very poor. And Maqrizi's report on it is basically a positive report, that they tried to reinstall an Islamic rule in Egypt against these Mamluks who don't deserve to be the rulers. He's extremely explicit in his criticism. And he talks about the sultans in the most derogatory terms. And this is a period in which you have to remember that if the Sultan gets angry at you, he will cut you in half. I mean, literally cut you in half. And many people were being cut in half. And Maqrizi is sitting there and saying, this is a Sultan that does not respect Islam. This is a corrupt Sultan, and calls him name. He calls him actually a monkey. So if the Sultan hears that, of course, actually, Maqrizi would have been decapitated into pieces.
Mamluks used to be bought at a young age and were put through rigorous training and a thorough religious education before they were manumitted and enlisted in the army. That is why they were skillful and thoughtful leaders who managed a great empire and fought for the cause of Islam. The system was relaxed under Barkuk, who allowed his Mamluks to live in the city and to socialize with the local population through marriage and business transactions. It deteriorated even further under Faraj bin Barkuk, when new Mamluks were brought at a fairly advanced age after their character had already been formed and were no longer required to undergo an extensive religious education before their manumission. Consequently, the Sultanian Mamluks became the lowest of people, the most undignified and greedy, and the most ignorant in worldly matters and in religion. They became more lustful than monkeys, more ravenous than rats, and more harmful than wolves. No wonder then that the land of Egypt and Sham was ruined from the Nile to the Euphrates because of the venality in assigning governing positions, the exploitation of governors, and the depravity of those in charge.
Another thing that makes Maqrizi stand out is that from his writing, we get this really rich picture about his personal life. So it's almost like he was writing a diary. It's called actually a biographical dictionary.
Yes.
And so in it, we have descriptions of all the people he knew. So members of his family, teachers, friends, Sufis who would meet in these prayer halls, these khanqahs, rivals, patrons, and even emirs and sultans. And what's unique is that he doesn't just describe these, but he also wrote about his interactions with these people. So he's kind of like musing about members of his social circle, reflecting on the vagaries of life, and also complaining about the growing immorality of the Mamluks. What made him different in terms of this biographical dictionary to others who were also writing those?
I would say he was emotional. He tells us about the people that meant a lot to him. So this is also a guy who is, and he says that at the beginning of this book, and he says, like, I now reached the age of 50. I've lost a lot of the people that I love. So I'm going to write about them because I miss them. So there is this nostalgia. There is this notion of loss that is motivating him to write.
There are some intriguing references to divination and what's known as geomancy, which is a way to predict the future from markings on the ground. So you have this vision of these somber, serious men who you imagined would scoff at astrology, but they were all secretly sitting around reading their horoscopes.
Including the great Ibn Khaldun. And some of the rivals of Maqrizi say that the reason why Ibn Khaldun chose Maqrizi to be part of his inner circle is because Maqrizi had read his horoscope and predicted that he was going to be appointed the chief judge of the Malikis in Cairo, and that happened. So Ibn Khaldun now started revering and respecting Maqrizi. That is not a story reported by Maqrizi or by Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was such a haughty person, he doesn't speak about anyone else but himself. Maqrizi speaks about Ibn Khaldun with all terms of reverence and respect and admiration. And he tells us a lot about the interaction between the two. Maqrizi does not say much about geomancy, but he actually quotes other people in his own writing speaking about his own divination. He himself, not a single time does he say that, and I'm a diviner as well, and I do this and I do that.
So was he practicing astrology? He claimed not to be, but is this what people did? Was it accepted?
It was very much accepted. And everyone from the Sultan all the way down had their horoscope read for them in various manners. So it was very widespread. And we know that. I mean, in medieval period, everyone in the Islamic world believed in the notion of astrology, and astrology was very big, and divination was very big, and there were very big names who were diviners first and foremost. Maqrizi is a diviner on the side, if you want. He himself does not say anything about it. He never said that I am someone who had read the horoscope up to so and so. But there are so many that say that he is a diviner for us to dismiss them. But he is aware of the potential of tarnishing a reputation of a serious historian by saying, and I'm a diviner at the same time. So he ignores it in his writing about himself.
One last thing that makes him stand out is the way he talks about the women in his life. Who were these women and how does he talk about them?
You know, he was a fils à maman. He actually felt very close to his mother. And he writes a biography of his mother, the like of which is very rare in that period. Other people wrote about their mothers, but normally without that sort of like edge of sentimentality that appears in his biography. And he doesn't say at any point that I love my mom, but he tells you, my mom was the most pious woman. My mom was the most patient woman. My mom was the best mother. My mom was this. He never says, I love her, I adore her. But you can read from all of that he was very much actually attached to his mother. And then he ascribes to her, even though she was illiterate, he ascribes to her poetry that she has heard and repeated to him, and that she had this deep knowledge of popular sciences and popular beliefs. So she would tell him all these parables, and she would repeat some of the stories about what is good for you. If you have a headache, you do this and that, you know, these popular recipes that they have. That's one. Second is his wife. So he married this woman when he is about 25 or so, and she is maybe 16, 17. And she doesn't play any role in his life in a sense. But there are two things that are very unusual about her biography. The first is that he divorced her and then he remarried her. And when he remarried her, he had a dream that he interpreted as she's not going to stay long with him. And she dies 2 years later. And then she comes to him in the dream. And he reports that Maqrizi actually depends very much on dreams to convey to us his feelings and his opinions. So she comes and he sort of like greets her with a lot of respect. And he says, does what I'm sending you reach you? And she says, yes, thank you, Master. And it's helped me a lot. And then he tells us that I pray for the salvation of her soul every night. And I send it to her after her death. So that's his wife. The third and the most interesting figure in his life is his slave girl. And it's a slave girl at the age of 15 by the very romantic name of Soul. So this woman, 15 years old, he buys her from the house of the Sultan when he was a boon companion to Sultan Barquq. And he takes her home. And he doesn't tell us anything about their relationship, but he adored her, in my opinion. He speaks about her piety, about her behavior, well-behavior, and so on. And then he says in an extremely enigmatic sentence, and something happened that I had to let her go. Basically, he sold her off. But he tells us her new master is from Mecca, and she dies in Mecca in 1426, and he sold her off in like 1410. In a conservative Islamic society, you don't know anything about the women of other men. How did he know that she was this? And he says that she actually had children with her new master, which means that she didn't have children with him. And then he ends the biography with 3 verses from a poem by someone else, and then a verse that I couldn't locate. And the gist of these 4 is, I am so sad to have lost you, and I am doing divination, this geomancy, in order to see in the sand if there is any indication that we will meet again.
Let's talk about Maqrizi and the Fatimids. So Maqrizi wrote extensively about the Fatimid Empire, which ruled Egypt about 200 years before the Mamluks. His work is cited heavily in books about Fatimid history.
He's our main source.
He's the main source about Fatimid history.
His book on the Fatimid, which has an extremely unusual title, is our main source on the Fatimid.
What's the unusual title?
So the book is called اتعاظ الحنفاء بأخبار الفاطميين الأئمة الفاطميين الخلفاء. You have to remember we are in the 15th century. The Fatimids are Ismaili. Egypt is Sunni. The Ismailis have been suppressed very heavily in Egypt by the dynasty between the Fatimid and the Mamluks, and that is the Ayyubid. And they have been eliminated. So there are no Ismailis in Egypt, at least not in the capital. They might be in Upper Egypt, in villages and so on. Maqrizi believed that he was a descendant of a branch of the Fatimid family, so that gave him some sort of a claim to a Fatimid ancestry, and he believed in it. But the point is that he writes a book full of praise of the Fatimid at the period in which they are considered to be un-Islamic by the consensus of the Egyptians. Here is a guy who comes in and calls them al-A'imma al-Fatimiyin al-Khulafa. So he's accepting in the title that they are imams, even though he might not know the extent to which the term imam for Ismailis is somewhat divine, whereas for Sunnis, they don't see the divine dimension of the term imam. But then he also calls them al-khulafa. So he accepts that they are the caliphs, which is something that the Abbasids have actually fought against and managed to stamp it out from the public discourse, that no one acknowledges the Fatimid as caliphs. So he acknowledged them as imams and caliph in the title. And the first part of the title is Itti'az al-Hunafa. Hunafa is the plural of Hanif, which is the term in the Quran for people who believe in the one God, but who are not part of any of the three monotheistic religions. So what is Maqrizi saying is that here are lessons. Itti'az is actually to have izah, to take a lesson. So these are the lessons for those who believe in the one God, which means that Maqrizi is saying this is a book not just for Muslims, but also for Christians and Jews. They are all Hunafa. And it is about the history of these imams and caliphs. That had garnered him so much criticism from his contemporaries that said, oh, it's probably because he believed that he's a descendant of the Fatimid that he is writing so positively about them. They even say that he adored Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Khaldun was a much more wily person. So Ibn Khaldun accepted the lineage of the Fatimid back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, whereas the consensus was that they were the descendants of some sort of a maybe Zoroastrian, maybe Jewish person called Maymun al-Qaddah, who actually was plotting to infiltrate the Islamic society through the claim of a branch of the Fatimid, of the family of the Prophet, that will later on be called the Fatimid, as being the rightful rulers of the Islamic society during the Abbasid period. Now, of course, actually, we can't verify any of that. But what we can verify is that in the 15th century, Maqrizi was one out of two historians, the other is Ibn Khaldun, who accepted the genealogy of the Fatimid back to the Prophet and wrote a book in which he aggrandized them no end. He spoke about their palaces, their policy, their wisdom, and so on. And every few pages, he says, and I am denying their creed. I do not believe in their creed. And yet, I'm going to tell you how great they were. So that I deny their creed is to insist on his Sunnism. He doesn't want to be taken as an Ismaili. There are few people who said that his love of the family of the Prophet is even greater than any of his contemporary, but I think actually this is still within the Sunni realm. He does not go into the Shia side of things.
Well, I think one of the things that we do see is that the love of the family of the Prophet was quite
widespread.
Predominant, yeah,
Oh,
quite
absolutely.
widespread.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, you can see it even today in Egypt. And I'll tell you this story that happened to me in my first visit to Egypt. I'm leaving Cairo, and I'm in the cab, and we are driving. At the time, you could drive in front of Al Azhar Mosque and Al Hussein Mosque on your left hand side. So as we are driving, my driver is driving, and then he takes his palm, his right palm, and he puts it on the window as we are driving next to Al Hussein, and he murmurs few things. And I look at him and I say, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "I'm sending blessing to Al Hussein." And I'm like, "Are you Shiite?" And he goes, "A'udhu billah, I'm not. I'm Sunni." And I'm like, "Why are you doing that?" And he goes, "He's our saint." So the Sunni Egyptians until today do not see the Hussein as just a Shiite figure. He's the saint of Egypt.
Tell us how Maqrizi's work has lived on. We know that his book about the history of Egypt, the Kitat, has been copied more than any other medieval Egyptian manuscript. What does that mean?
Well, it means that it had a wide readership, because the more manuscript of a book exists, the more people can have access to it. Remember, printing does not come until the 19th century. So in order to propagate a book, you have to copy it. And so far, there have been about 250 manuscripts of that. There are other authors that have larger numbers of manuscripts, but in medieval Egypt, in 15th century Egypt, there's no one that even reaches 100. This guy has reached 250. So we're talking about someone that was extremely popular in a way. And then he was also the first historian to be translated into European languages. He was one of the few to be translated into Turkish by the Ottoman historians, and he became known in Ottoman intellectual circles. But then immediately in the 17th century, extracts of his books, especially the ones that speak about the Crusades, and especially the Crusade of Louis IX in Egypt, because he has a big section on that in his history book, is translated for King Louis XIV in France. That's his ancestor, Louis IX, and now Louis XIV gets his own Orientalist to translate Maqrizi. So Maqrizi gets into European languages from around 1690. That meant that for people who are interested in history of Egypt and history of Islam, Maqrizi became a major source for Orientalists.
So these ruling powers that came afterwards, what was it that was interesting for them in Maqrizi's work?
For the Ottomans, it was basically a way of figuring out how to rule this very wealthy and very important province that they added to their empire. So they needed to know more about the history of Egypt. The most important thing for the Ottomans is to learn more about the Iqta, the land allotment under the Mamluks, because they did the same thing. They're actually dependent on income from land allotment for their troops that are there, and also for the taxation that Istanbul is collecting. So Maqrizi has some sort of a history of the Iqta, that they could figure out how the land was managed and manipulated and so on. The other important thing about him is actually his theory of ruination, and that makes him and Ibn Khaldun very important to the Ottoman intellectuals from the 18th century on, who are realizing that they are losing the civilizational battle with the West. And they're looking for reasons. It's like, why is this happening? So here we have two precedents, two historians who have written about ruination and about disintegration of empire. Let us try to figure out what they're saying. Maybe we can learn from it. So they become, Ibn Khaldun and Maqrizi, they become important for that pursuit. And this is a huge debate which we still live in today, which is basically, does the Islamic world have its own self-generated means of rejuvenation and recapturing, or does it have to follow the model of the Europeans? So those who were actually looking for sort of like indices from Islamic history, Ibn Khaldun and Maqrizi become very important for them.
And the French, what was interesting for them?
Initially, it was just basically the history of the Crusade and the history of Louis IX. But then the French, remember, Napoleon is the first colonizer in the Arab world, and he lands in Egypt in 1798. So his scholars, those who he had brought with him from the Oriental Institute in Paris, and those who actually came from other walks of life, depends very much on Al-Maqrizi in writing the huge compendium that Napoleon orders, which is called the Description de l'Égypte, the description of Egypt. And it's actually huge. It's 9 volumes of text of the large format, octave format, and 12 or 13 volumes of figures.
The Europeans were interested in him also because he speaks about Christians and Jews.
Yes.
In what context does he do this? And why is he unique in doing this?
He's unique for 2 reasons. The first reason is his willingness and his curiosity to learn about the different sects that existed, and he writes about them in the Khitat. The second is that he's the only one who had written outside of the Christians. There are Christian historians, of course, Coptic historians, about the churches of Egypt. So there's a section about the churches and the synagogues of Egypt in the Khitat. As a matter of fact, the Khitat, which I am proving in my book, has never been completed. That is, Maqrizi died before he finished it, stops abruptly with the list of the churches. And it's as if like somebody had just thrown the pen and we stop, and even the churches are not yet complete, but no comment. It's sort of like, here is the list of the churches. This church is in this town, and it's and on, and then it stops. So the Khitat is incomplete, but the Khitat contains information that doesn't appear anywhere else. The second and most important point about why Maqrizi is important for the history of Christians and Jews is that he is one of the very few Muslim ulama, Muslim scholars, who actually have informants who are Christians and Jews, and he mentions them in his Biographical Dictionary, Durar al-Farida. There's an Israeli scholar who I met in Bonn while the two of us were on fellowship at the Mamluk Institute in the University of Bonn, who actually was there to work on some rabbi. And then when I gave my presentation on Maqrizi and spoke about how Maqrizi was connected to certain Jewish rabbis in Egypt, he actually shifted, and he has published now 4 articles analyzing the writing of Maqrizi on Jewish issues and proving that they could not have come from Arabic sources. They needed to have come from Hebrew or Jewish oral sources. So Maqrizi had access to those.
Which was unusual at the time?
Very unusual.
Because?
Because the separation between the scholars of the different communities was almost complete. They did not speak to each other.
How many Christians and Jews were in Egypt at the time?
Jews probably negligible, maybe 0.5%. Christians, during the time of Al-Maqrizi, I would say between 30 and 40% of the population is Christian. So we're talking about a very sizable minority.
When did this change, that they stopped talking to each other?
No, they didn't stop talking to each other. But scholarly pursuits for a Muslim scholar are very different than scholarly pursuits for a Christian scholar. So they don't go to the same school. They don't read the same books. They don't deal with the same issues. So there's no reason for them to interact.
So if we continue with how Maqrizi's work has lived on, we had Napoleon order a complete history of Egypt, which was based heavily on Maqrizi's work. And then Maqrizi is printed in Egypt.
But then Maqrizi is printed in Egypt, especially the Khitat, in 1853. And he becomes now the recovered historian of Egypt for the Egyptians. This is the same period in which nationalism is rising and people are starting to identify as Egyptians. And here we have someone who actually encapsulates what it means to be Egyptian. So he becomes the model that all the historians that are looking for a nationalist model, he becomes that one. And then because of his criticism and because of his lamentation of what's happening in Egypt at his own time, after the war of 1967, he is discovered by the creatives, by authors and novelists and so on. And he becomes part of that discourse about the ruination of the country, what happened after the defeat of 1967, and how Maqrizi is a guiding light to how can we critique what's happening around us.
Tell us what happened there and and why this was the case?
So, for non-Arabs, 1967 is called the Six-Day War, and it's a glorification of the fact that Israel defeated 3 Arab countries in 6 days. And it was really a devastating defeat. It actually somehow turned the vision of self in the Arab world topsy-turvy, and the Arabs lost faith in the project of building a modern state that was led by my namesake, or by the person that I'm named after, and that is Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt between 1954 and 1970 when he died. He is the one that was defeated in 1967, and the army was totally destroyed by the Israelis in 48 hours. It was a huge strategic mistake that led to that destruction. And the generation post-1967, the war of 1967, is the generation of defeat. And it's a generation that is trying to come out of that sense of defeat, of that deep sadness and deep melancholy and deep anger that the defeat has caused. The Arabs lived for 20 years on the promise that it would be very easy to defeat Israel and to build the modern state and to build the progressive state. 1967 stopped all of that, and what we see today in what's happening in the Arab world is all the result of the defeat of 1967. The rise of Islamism as an alternative project to the project of nationalism, the segregation, the disintegration, the division in the Arab world, the loss of the cause of Palestine, all of that is actually a result of the defeat of 1967. So Maqrizi appears at that moment for people who are seeking models of the past as someone who has experienced a sense of defeat, a sense of disintegration, and reacted to it, and as someone who actually expresses his love of the country as the motivator behind his involvement in the criticism of the rulers of his time. Therefore, he becomes not only the historical source that every single historian, whether it's an Orientalist or an Egyptian or an Arab who is working on the history of Egypt, needs to go back to Maqrizi, but for the Egyptians, he becomes the nationalist model. For the Egyptian historians, they actually deal with him as someone who they have just had tea with yesterday, and they are now going to quote him in their writing as someone who's actually expressing their feeling, their standing. And then the novelists discover him, and they use him in fabulously creative ways. I will speak about 2 of them. One is called The Travels of the Maker of Pickles and Sweets, رحلات الطرشج الحلوجي, of the novelist Khairi Shalabi. He died about 10 years ago. And in it, the narrator, whose name is Ibn Shalabi, which means it's the author himself, receives an invitation from the Caliph Al-Mu'izz to go back to Cairo in the year in which Al-Mu'izz arrives in Cairo, 972.
Founds Cairo.
And now he is celebrating the first Ramadan, and Ibn Shalabi is invited to attend that. So Ibn Shalabi is sort of like stumbling in the space and time continuum, trying to get back to Al-Mu'izz. And along the way, he meets guides, and Maqrizi appears 6 times in the novel as a guide. And then he actually says something, because why Ibn Shalabi or Khairi Shalabi is writing this novel is Khairi Shalabi is part of the generation of defeat. And he is dismayed at the change of the national character of the Egyptians. They were kind, they were humorous, and they were accepting of their fate and sort of like constantly maintaining a positive outlook on life. He is seeing now in the 1970s, 1980s, with the financial and economic burdens that were added by this new opening up under Sadat, he is seeing those characters disappearing. So he uses his idea of going back to Al-Mu'izz to recover the original Egyptian character. And Maqrizi is a guide in that. Maqrizi appears in different points in time. And Maqrizi says, what happens to this building in your own time? And Khairi Shalabi says, it's destroyed, and now it has changed its name. And Maqrizi comments by saying, "O Egypt, how many names your memory has retained." And it seems to me this expression, this just one clause, encapsulates what Maqrizi means to the Egyptian. He is the guardian of their memory. He's the person who kept the memory of Egypt for the contemporary Egyptian to recover and to basically learn from. The second model is a much more interesting model, and that is the tragic poet Naguib Surur, who died in 1977 and who wrote a year before he died this one poem that is called Tada'iyat al-Sikr wal-Diya. It was translated as Drink Delirium, but it's not a direct translation, but it's a very expressive translation. And in it, he speaks to Maqrizi and says to Maqrizi, you are the one who actually identified what's wrong in the government, and you are the one that went after the corruption of the government. You are the one that went after all of these people that are stealing the public goods, and you lost your daughter in the plague, and other daughters, and the plague and the famine have ruined Egypt. I am going to follow your model in critiquing. I'm no longer going to write poetry. I'm only going to write khitat, because the khitat is the book of criticism. It's very beautiful poetry, by the way.
Let's take a step back now. What is the status of Islamic art and architecture?
Where?
Globally.
There are optimistic way of looking at it, and there are pessimistic way of looking at it. The positive is that in the 1980s and 1990s, the preponderance of interest in Islamic art and architecture, specifically in the United States and to a lesser degree in Europe, actually much lesser degree in Europe, meant that we have produced more and more scholars. The existence of the Aga Khan Program at MIT and Harvard has created an anchor for that, and we have actually produced some of the best scholars in the field. I mean, I have students who teach all around the world at this point in time, and so does Gulru from Harvard. When I first joined the PhD program, there were 6 positions in Islamic art in America. Today, there are more than 50. So we have grown exponentially in terms of presence. Every single big university or major university in America now has an Islamic art and architectural historian on its faculty. That was not the case. There are still universities that only recently, I mean, Brown University, one of the most important universities, had its first Islamic art and architectural historian last year. The rising antagonism against Islam in the West and the identification with Muslims with terrorism, or Islamism with terrorism, has led to lesser interest in the Western academe of Islamic culture and more interest in security studies. And Islamic art has suffered because of that, of course. In the Islamic world itself, there is now attempts at creating centers for the study of Islamic art and architecture. They really have not measured up. So there are professorships in Islamic art and architecture now from Morocco all the way to Indonesia, but they have not really yet taken over the discourse and produced the scholarship. I would say the hope of the field is in the hyphenated scholars that today practice in the West, but who have roots in the Islamic world.
Why is that?
Because they have the empathy that you need for your study. They're not approaching it as curiosity or with connoisseurship, which was an earlier generation of students of Islamic art in here. These are people who are vested in what they are studying. The second is that they are learning the sophistication of approach, the methodologies, the theories, and so on in top universities. And they are now using that learning in order to highlight and understand better the heritage that to them is theirs. So there is that empathy in the relationship.
If you think about the study of Islamic art and architecture and the study of art and architecture of other regions or fields, how does it compare?
We still are way, way, way too small and way, way, way too insignificant. And the most important thing is that the Islamic world is not vested in the study of Islamic art and architecture, partly because of religious reservation in some places, partly because of mismanagement, partly because of other interests.
Why is it important to study art and architecture?
I would say the most important reason is aesthetic, is the fact that we are interested in beauty. And when I say beauty, I don't mean beauty in a very strict sense of the word, but beauty as an expression of human engagement with the world. and as an expression of human aspiration for a more positive, a more equitable engagement with the world. So I am using aesthetics here in a sense that is very close to the way it was used, erroneously, I should say, when beauty was equated to high morality, like you are beautiful and therefore you are moral. So, of course, actually, this is no longer something that we would subscribe to, but there was a period in time in which philosophy was actually allowing such comparisons. I am now thinking of art and architecture as fields of studies that are for the betterment of human life, and therefore they are important to study.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in Boston, Massachusetts by Miraj Hakim, Amir Hakim, and Malik Nota. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Aleem Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Layla Sharif is our social media strategist, who's managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts. And Alia Muhammad is supporting with promoting the series externally. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Dr. Nadia Ibu Jamal, who lectures on the history of Muslim societies, Ali Asani, who is the Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University, Arif Jamal, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Farid Panjwani, who is the Dean of the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University. Additional reviews were also provided by Dr. Alnur Danani, who specializes in the history of Islamic science, philosophy, and religious thought. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.